Welcome into another show, ladies and gentlemen. I am Ricky Larson, your host. Brock is not here today. He's got some stuff going on, but he should be back next week for us. Little bit of a pack show today, just by myself, but we got some fantasy or reality, going to be a new segment that we're doing. We'll look at some people to drop, hold, or trade. Then your starts, sits of the week, some buy or sell. Then we'll take a look at the matchups. A lot of good, interesting matchups this week. But let's start it off with the Boomers of the Week.
Boom, boom. Players of the Week, baby.
Starting off at quarterback, we have Tom Brady. He had a heck of a game, scoring 31.84 fantasy points this week. That coming in his game against Carolina, and a really good bounce back week for him after only scoring 2.36 against New Orleans in the previous week. He had 341 passing yards, 3 passing touchdowns, and he even ran a touchdown in this week. Great bounce back week for him, and maybe he can do that again this week. If you're owning Tom Brady right now, you're not really worried. This is one of the first weeks he's had a fantasy week like this. So nothing to be scared about, and he's got a lot of different weapons that he's starting to build chemistry with. I think every receiver for him this past week had over 10 points, so really spreading the ball around, and I think if they can keep that up, Tom Brady will continue to score like he did this week. Coming in at the number 2 quarterback spot was Kyler Murray. Murray scored 29.9 fantasy points against Buffalo, and man, what a game. You had the Bills scoring the game-winning touchdown, it seemed like. Beautiful pass by Josh Allen to Stephon Diggs, but Kyler Murray comes back, works his magic, does his best Aaron Rodgers impression, just throws up a Hail Mary, and the acquisition of DeAndre Hopkins has paid off because the guy went up through 4 defenders and came down with that touchdown pass and won the Cardinals the game. Just an absolutely crazy finish, great game, and Kyler Murray, again, in the top 5, probably where he'll finish for the rest of the year. He had 245 passing yards with a rushing touchdown and an interception, but he also ran for 61 yards and 2 touchdowns. That's part of the reason he always scores so much, is because he can also get in on the ground. So, Kyler Murray, great game, 29.9 fantasy points. Moving on to the number 3 quarterback this week, Ben Roethlisberger. Looks like only the 3rd time this season he's gone over 300 passing yards. Season high, 333, and a season high in touchdowns with 4. Ben doesn't do a whole lot else besides just throw the ball, but this Steelers team, they can't run the ball all that well so far this season, but Ben's got all the weapons, and he utilized all of them this past week. You got Juju, you got Chase Claypool, Deontay Johnson was actually healthy all the way through the week, so Ben just utilized that and played very well in their win against Cincinnati. Moving on to Jacksonville next week, probably an even better matchup, so expect to see Big Ben probably back in this top 5. Next up, we have Josh Allen at the number 4 spot. He scored 27.36 fantasy points this week. One of his touchdowns this week was a receiving touchdown. So very, very interesting Josh Allen's getting his points still, but it's just coming in weird ways. But we'll talk about him a little later when we get down to that drop, hold, or trade area. You have Aaron Rodgers back in the top 10 with 25.4 fantasy points. Matt Stafford with 23.04 at the number 6 spot. At the number 7 spot, we have Daniel Jones with 22.16 fantasy points. Lamar Jackson back in the top 10 for first time in a while with 21.46 fantasy points. Justin Herbert consistently in the top 10, sitting at number 9 this week with 20.48 fantasy points, and Teddy Bridgewater with 19.04 fantasy points. Moving on to the running backs, no shocker here. Same thing every week, and it's just crazy. We have Alvin Kamara sitting in this number 1 spot with 34.8 fantasy points, and the crazy thing is he's a running back. He only had 15 rushing yards. He did have 2 scores on the ground, but all of his points come through the air, just like all year. 7 catches, 83 yards, receiving touchdown. If this wasn't a PPR league, Alvin Kamara would not be a huge fantasy stud. He gets close to 100 scrimmage yards every week, but if he didn't have all the receptions, he wouldn't be as relevant. But with Drew Brees going down this past week, fractured ribs, a collapsed lung is what it's looking like. You got to wonder if Alvin Kamara gets a spike in even more touches, or if he possibly goes down in touches, being that Jameis Winston will be the quarterback, presumably, I guess, this coming week. But you never know. We'll just have to see. But Alvin Kamara is a special player, probably will be back in the top 10 regardless. At the number 2 spot, we have Josh Jacobs. In his game against the Broncos, had 112 rushing yards, 2 rushing touchdowns, and 4 catches for 24 yards in their win. And the Raiders seemingly just did whatever they wanted against the Broncos. And Josh Jacobs turned in a 29.6 point fantasy week, and that is his highest scoring week since week 1 when he had 3 rushing touchdowns. So Josh Jacobs is also a stud, and good to see him finally get back on track and have a game like that one. Very nice to see. And in the 3rd spot, one of the guys Brock has been talking about and I've been trying to dismiss for most of the past few weeks is Nyheim Hines. The guy just went crazy last week. He had 12 carries for 70 yards and a touchdown, and 5 catches for 45 yards and another touchdown coming in the game against the Titans. And I tried to stay reserved on Nyheim Hines just because you still had Jonathan Taylor, who seemed to be the number 1 back. You had Jordan Wilkins, who that one week was out touching everybody and looked like the actual running back for the team. But the Colts are just, I guess, finding that Nyheim Hines is the better option of all 3 of those guys, getting him involved on the ground, through the air. He's kind of starting to maybe look like a little bit of a mini Alvin Kamara. But 28.5 fantasy points this week. Nyheim Hines, you look at it, and he plays Tennessee, not this coming week, but the week after, and Tennessee is who he just scored this 28.5 points against. So possibly a repeat coming very soon for him. And, if you look at his playoff matchups, he plays Houston twice, the Raiders, and then Pittsburgh. So, you have 3 matchups in that playoff area where, he could be a guy you pick up and plug in, and he scores you a top 10 game. So keep an eye out for him being here in this top 10 and being in the top 5 for, I believe, the second time this season. Then you have DeAndre Swift going out there and doing DeAndre Swift things again. 25.9 fantasy points. And, I think if the Lions are smart, they're going to keep giving the guy the ball. And these fantasy points are going to continue to come. Then you had Ronald Jones at the number 5 spot with 24.8 fantasy points. He, beginning of the game, didn't look good for him. Dropped a pass, fumbled the ball, and with Bruce Arians, you're thinking just, oh, well, take him out. That's what Bruce Arians does. He's going to punish him for not handling the football well. And then they kept him in, and he ripped off a 98-yard touchdown. Absolutely monster game from Ronald Jones, and it's a good sign if you're a Ronald Jones owner, not necessarily just because of the points, but because Bruce Arians didn't just take him out, put him on the bench because of his fumble and drop pass. So Ronald Jones coming in at number 5. Antonio Gibson sitting at the 6th spot at 22.6 fantasy points. And Rex Burkhead sitting right behind him with 22.5 in that number 7 spot. Then you have Devin Booker at number 8 with 21.3 fantasy points. Malcolm Brown with 19.1 and Wayne Gallman with 19. Then we move on to the wide receivers. In that top spot, you have Cole Beasley. I don't know what to think of this because this is his second 100-yard, 11-catch game, and he tacked on a touchdown. The Bills are kind of just up and down, especially in that passing game. We know they don't have a running game, but in that passing game, you don't know who Josh Allen's really going to throw the ball to. It seems like Cole Beasley was trending up to be a main target, and then he had the 2 weeks against New England and Seattle where he had 2 catches and 3 catches. I honestly don't know what to think of this. Cole Beasley may be a guy that you could put in your flex, but they have a bye this coming week, and then they have the Chargers, which is a plus matchup, but then they have San Francisco, Pittsburgh, Denver might be an okay matchup, New England and Miami, so I still just feel like if Josh Allen is in trouble or if the game's on the line, the ball's going to go to Stephon Diggs. So Cole Beasley, top spot. Don't know if that'll be a consistent thing. Number 2, we have Keelan Cole Sr. with 27.7 fantasy points, and the guy was doing it all. He not only had his receiving stats, but he had a kickoff or punt return for a touchdown as well. Only 5 catches for 47 yards and a touchdown. But again, he had the punt return for a touchdown as well. He's a guy that I have been talking about, saying, watch him because he's a decent player, and he is on a team where there's not a whole lot of stars, so he has an equal opportunity to have big games. And this week he did, 27.7 fantasy points. At number 3, we have DeAndre Hopkins. Already talked about his incredible catch up in between all of the defenders on a Hail Mary for the game-winning touchdown. Absolutely fantastic, and he comes in the top 3 spots. And then his counterpart, who thought he had the game-winning touchdown in that game, Stephon Diggs, with 25.3 fantasy points. At number 5, you have Marquez Valdez-Scantling with 24.9 fantasy points. And this is one that is just irritating to people because Scantling either catches a 70-yard touchdown or is fantasy irrelevant. And you just never know when to gauge it. And you just never know if you can put him in and hope that he gets a long touchdown like that. Let me take a look, because it was not too long ago that he had another 70-yard score like that. Let's get to him here. I think it would have been last week when he had a 50-yard touchdown. But his stat line was 2 for 53 and 2 touchdowns. This week, 4 for 149 and a touchdown, but one of those was like a 70, 80-yard touchdown. He's a guy that I think, if anything, you can flex, but it's a cautionary flex because you never know if he's going to actually get those big-time plays, and we're getting to the point in the season where you don't want to just bet on that. You need something consistent, especially if you're trying to make a playoff run. At number 6, we have Marvin Jones putting in his work with Kenny Golladay out. Had 23.6 fantasy points, and right there with him was Deontay Johnson with 23.6. You had Willie Snead at number 8 with 23.4 fantasy points. Juju Smith-Schuster with 22.7, and right there I told you that those wide receivers for the Steelers, they're all just beneficiaries of Ben throwing the ball well, and Chase Claypool somewhere just barely outside of this top 10 as well. So great games from all three guys. And just real quick, if I had to rank all three of them, Deontay Johnson, a healthy Deontay Johnson would be number 1. Chase Claypool, just based on his targets from the past 2 weeks, would be that number 2 guy. And then Juju is number 3, but I think all of them are wide receiver 1, wide receiver 2 eligible in whatever league you're in. And then at number 10, we had T. Higgins with 22.5 fantasy points. Moving on to the tight ends. The tight ends are just tough to talk about anymore. We had Travis Kelce on bye, so obviously he's not in this top 10. He probably could have scored just as many points as the top 3 guys combined. All of them sitting within a tenth of a point from each other. But nothing spectacular. And again, these tight ends are just a dart throw, and you just got to hope maybe one of them scores a touchdown if you plug them in. You had Rob Gronkowski and Mark Andrews in that 1 and 2 spot with 13.1 fantasy points. Hunter Henry with 13. Cameron Brate with 12.1. Jordan Reed with 11.2. Logan Thomas with 10.6. Pharaoh Brown with 10.1. Richard Rodgers with 10. Jonnu Smith with 9.5. And Tyler Higbee with 9. Nothing over 15 points. So, I mean, at least this week, if you were in a close matchup, at least you didn't have somebody with a tight end that absolutely murdered you, because none of the tight ends did hardly anything good this week. Moving on to the kicker rankings, just because we had quite a few big scores this week. You had Tyler Bass scoring 18 points. He had 3 extra points and then made 3 50-plus yard field goals. The guy's got a nice leg, and he's only a rookie, so it's a guy that, you know, he is honestly an equalizer as a kicker, because if you're in a close matchup and your kicker pulls off 18 points, that's a huge equalizer because not all kickers are doing that. So it's a great way to just make up a few extra points in a game that's really close. Then you have Ryan Suckup. He had 4 extra points made, 3 30-yard field goals, and a 40-yard field goal to come in at that number 2 spot. You had Matt Prater, a guy that he just seems to stick around. Haven't really heard a lot of his name this season, a little bit last season, but he had 3 extra points made, a 30-yard field goal made, and 2 50-yarders made, and one of those 50-yarders was the game-winning kick. So, very close game with Washington, a fun game to watch, and then you have Matt Prater, the kicker, coming out and being the hero. But that is it for your boomers. And all right, so that is it for your boomers this week. It's time to move on to our new segment, Fantasy or Reality.
Is it all just a fantasy, or is this reality?
All right, starting off our Fantasy or Reality segment, we have Nyheim Hines with 20-plus points in the last 2 of 3 weeks. And the Fantasy or Reality is he a running back 2 option the rest of the year? It's just so tough to gauge because the 2 of the last 3 weeks, it was big week, nothing, big week. And that running back situation in Indy is just so hard. And you think I would not be doubting Nyheim Hines anymore from 2 big performances like that. But I mean, I guess if you're hurting at your running back spot, it's not going to hurt you anymore to put Nyheim Hines in there. He's got that higher ceiling and has looked good the past 3 weeks. And if he continues to be utilized like this, then yeah, I would say he's a running back 2 option. I don't know if you can trust, but you have to just have realistic expectations and keep them a little lower because then he will only exceed them. Aaron Jones, for Green Bay, this one kind of hurts my feelings a little bit, just the way he's utilized. He has less than 15 points in each game this since his return. He may be a low-end running back 1 or running back 2 the rest of the season. For me personally, I have Aaron Jones. And after this week, there is a good chance that Raheem Mostert would be back, and I have Raheem Mostert in my IR. And if I keep having to have the production of Aaron Jones that has been what it's been since he's come back from his injury, like if this is how the Packers are going to utilize him, there's a good chance, you could put him down to a running back 2, maybe even a slot, or not slot, but a flex. So I'm saying, yeah, Aaron Jones, it's a reality that he could be a low-end running back 1 or 2 the rest of this season. Antonio Brown from Tampa Bay, 7 receptions on 8 targets last week, getting more involved in the passing game. He's had a decent target share since he started with the Bucs. So the fantasy or reality, is he a wide receiver 2 for the rest of the season? There's just so many other options out there that are better options. I think if you're going to play Antonio Brown at all, it needs to be in a flex position. So I'm going to say that's a fantasy. I see the most value of him being a flex player. Next up, fantasy or reality. Nick Chubb and Kareem Hunt for Cleveland. They both had 100 yards last week in Chubb's return, and running back 1 or high-end running back 2 rest of season for both of them? I believe so. I think these guys are top 10 backs together. You saw Kareem Hunt the weeks that Nick Chubb was gone. Kareem Hunt wasn't as explosive, wasn't as much of a force as when Nick Chubb was there. And now Nick Chubb has come back, 100 rushing yards for each of them. Both of them had a very good game. I think they both complement each other very well. So I'm going to say that is reality, that both of them could be running back 1 or high-end running back 2s for the rest of the season. Then we have Justin Herbert for the Los Angeles Chargers. Compared to Joe Burrow this season, I think Herbert has played 1 less game, and he has 2,333 passing yards, or total yards, sorry, with 19 touchdowns and 6 interceptions, whereas Burrow has 2,485 for total yards, 12 touchdowns and 5 interceptions with 1 more game under his belt. So the fantasy or reality would be Justin Herbert will be the rookie of the year. I think he has definitely outplayed every other rookie. He's a consistent fantasy starter, at least for anybody this season. He's just he came in such a unique way, and just has played well the whole time and hasn't really had any games where they've been down games. Sure, the Chargers aren't winning every game, but it's not for a lack of good quarterback play, because Justin Herbert has played great every week. So I think it's a reality that Justin Herbert could be the rookie of the year this year. Moving on to the New York Giants, that they are the hottest team in the NFC East, which isn't saying much. But they are second in the NFC East. They have 2 straight wins, both against NFC East opponents. And anytime they've lost this year, it's by 10 or less in every game except for 1. And the fantasy or reality is that the Giants will win the NFC East. Just from watching the teams in the NFC East play, the Giants, to me, are the best team in that division. They aren't necessarily the most talented, and they're missing their star running back. But they just play hard. They play to win the game, and they stay in it with anybody. Looking at the rest of the schedule for the Giants, it's a little tough. But it's tough for the rest of the NFC East too. And they have a couple more divisional games mixed in there. So I think there is a very realistic chance that the Giants could win the NFC East and officially go down in the record books as the worst team to make the playoffs record-wise. All right, that was it for fantasy or reality. We're moving on to a drop, hold, or trade segment.
Drop, hold, or trade. Your choice.
All right, so we're going to start this segment off with somebody who I don't even have on here, but because of transactions that happened in one of my leagues yesterday, I'm going to bring it up. Josh Allen. So Josh Allen, had that 4-game skid. He's come back, had 2 pretty good games, but they were both in favorable matchups. And the rest of his season coming up, especially getting into these fantasy playoffs, he has the Chargers right before the playoffs. But then he has San Francisco, Pittsburgh, Denver, New England, Miami. Very tough matchups, and I don't know if I completely can trust him. to have more favorable matchups and have great games. So I traded Josh Allen yesterday for Justin Herbert, which is a very interesting thing just because Josh Allen has that 50-point game potential, but the matchups don't look in his favor, as where you have, say, Justin Herbert, who has the Jets, the Bills, a tough one against New England, but then Atlanta and Las Vegas, and then Denver. More favorable matchups. He has been more consistent. It's been 20 plus and from 20 to 30 every single week except for week 3 against Carolina. He's just very consistent. He doesn't turn the ball over a whole lot, and he scores touchdowns, whether it's through the air or on the ground. He's just consistent. So when it comes to Josh Allen, I would look at trading him as soon as possible, just to get out of those bad matchups for when playoff time comes. Moving on to Deshaun Watson. He has 6 games this season with 20 plus fantasy points, but only one game of 30 points. All of his 20-point games only came against decent or bad defenses. He hasn't played a whole lot of great defenses yet, and still the numbers are just consistent, nothing fantastic. But his remaining schedule going into these playoff weeks, he's got Indianapolis twice, Chicago, and New England, all teams that are very stingy against the pass and make it hard for quarterbacks to score points. And with Deshaun Watson, he's been in that middle area, hasn't really had a breakout, and the matchups are only going to get worse. And I believe everybody has trade deadlines coming up, so Deshaun Watson, if he's somebody you can trade to strengthen up a different position that really needs help for you to make a run, I would trade Deshaun Watson, and I think you could get a decent value out of him. James Conner from Pittsburgh. He's got 100 yards in only 3 of 9 games this season, only 2 20-point games, and has had 4 of his 9 games under 15 points. The Steelers just aren't running the ball very well this season. James Conner is one I would hold, but I would not necessarily play based on other things you have. Like if you have Nyheim Hines on your waivers that you can go pick up, I would start Nyheim Hines, I think, over James Conner, just because Nyheim Hines has a higher probability of getting more points than James Conner does, because James Conner that Pittsburgh offense isn't running the ball like a normal Pittsburgh offense would. So James Conner, one I would hold, try to look for a better option, and possibly put him on your bench. Michael Thomas for New Orleans. He's only played 3 games this season, and none of them have been great. He has no touchdowns. His scores in all 3 of those games were 4.7 points, 10.1, and 4.7. I think I am comfortable now at this point in the season dropping Michael Thomas, especially with the situation. But I also kind of think the situation could help him. But with not Teddy Bridgewater, Jameis Winston coming in as the quarterback, you don't know when Drew Brees is going to come back. You kind of have to think with Jameis Winston wanting to always throw the ball down the field, maybe Michael Thomas becomes more involved. But Jameis Winston is also a very inaccurate passer who throws a lot of interceptions, and that's going to cut into a Michael Thomas role. But there is that possibility because Winston played with Mike Evans, and Mike Evans was a stud because of the way the way that Jameis Winston likes to throw the ball. So possibly Michael Thomas could benefit from that. So I'm going to say a hold to drop. I would hold Michael Thomas, see if possibly this farther down the field targeting from Winston is a good thing for Thomas. And if it is, you can plug Thomas in. But I would be looking just to drop him. I don't necessarily know if anybody else wants him. You could try to trade, but there is no upside for anybody to trade for Michael Thomas besides the name that he has. And then you have Jonnu Smith from Tennessee. 4 of his 9 games this season have been under 10 points, less than 5 receptions in all but 2 games this season. He does have 2 games with 20 points. You know, he's still a hold just because of the way tight ends are this season. You don't have any other options, really. So Jonnu Smith, he's one of the better options. He was at least top 10, and even though it was a 9-point game, he's still in the top 10 of tight ends. And if you have a team you're going against that has a tight end out of the top 10, then you win that matchup automatically. So Jonnu Smith is a hold, but a very low expectation for him. That is it for the dropper hold this week. Let's move on to the starts of the week.
Start your engines.
All right. Starting off our starts of the week at quarterback is Kyler Murray versus the Seattle Seahawks. I try not to do obvious ones, but there's no way that I can't at least highlight Kyler Murray against Seattle. He played Seattle in Week 7, had 360 passing yards, 3 touchdowns, an interception, 67 rushing yards, and a rushing touchdown for 37.1 fantasy points. And honestly, I think that's coming again this week. Seattle hasn't done anything to improve that defense passing-wise. And Murray has 25 plus points in his last 5 games, with 2 of those being over 35. And Seattle, like I said, is 31st to quarterbacks and gives up at least 27.56 fantasy points per game to quarterbacks. So I think Kyler Murray is a huge start this week, and I would even venture to say, top 3 quarterback, if not the top quarterback this week for fantasy. I'm going to throw in another quarterback just to be less obvious, but still kind of obvious. You have Justin Herbert against the New York Jets. Again, if you got players going against the Jets, plug them in and reap the rewards. 20 plus points in every week except for 1 this season. He has 12 touchdowns in the 4 weeks since the bye. And the Jets are 29th to quarterbacks, giving up 23.11 fantasy points per game to quarterbacks. I think Justin Herbert just continues to be consistent, and this is going to be another big game for him. So start the lot of them with anybody from the Chargers. At running back, DeAndre Swift versus Carolina. Swift is a guy that you just have to plug and pray. He's a very good running back, and this matchup this week is against Carolina, who's 29th to fantasy running backs. And last week, he had 21 carries, touches, 149 yards, and a touchdown on a 40% snap share for the season. And, again, if Detroit was smart, they would make him the main focal point of the running game and involve him in the passing game. and Carolina gives up 20.8 fantasy points to running backs. So if he doesn't have to do a whole lot of sharing touches, I think it's a huge game again this week for DeAndre Swift. At wide receiver, man, I really hope I'm not jinxing myself because I'm playing him this week, and I haven't played him for quite a while because of his injuries. But Deontay Johnson for the Steelers against Jacksonville, coming off of his first 100-yard game on 11 targets last week, and he's had 20-plus points in 2 of the last 4 games. In back-to-back games, he's had 6 catches, and, everybody is getting involved receiver-wise for the Steelers, but Deontay Johnson has just proven to be that number 1 target. And Jacksonville is 23rd to wide receivers, giving up about 26.11 fantasy points per game. So I just think Deontay Johnson being that number 1 guy, if he can, especially if he can get double-digit targets again this week, I think he can turn it in to a lot more and have a big, big week. And at tight end, we're not going with the obvious Travis Kelce choice because obviously he's the only tight end that's really relevant. But I'm going with TJ Hawkinson versus Carolina. Hawkinson has 10-plus points in 3 of his last 4 games, with 3 touchdowns in the last 3 of 4 and 5 receptions in the last 3 of 4. Carolina's 21st to tight ends, and they give up about 8 points per game to tight ends. And honestly, with the way they're scoring, if Hawkinson can get 8, that would be great for anybody. That would especially have been great for me last week, where I had Jared Cook, who didn't score a single point. In an 8-point game would have actually won me the week. So TJ Hawkinson, I think, is a valuable start this week, and will score some points for you. The defensive start of the week are the Miami Dolphins against the Denver Broncos. The Dolphins have just been incredible these last 3 games. They've forced 6 turnovers, have scored 3 touchdowns, and have 5 sacks in the last 3 games. And they're taking on Denver, who has a negative 12 turnover ratio this season and has 6 turnovers in the last 2 games and have given up 3 sacks in the last 2 games. I think it is a smash start. I don't believe I put it's a lock in here this week, but if I was to have it's a lock, it would be the Dolphins defense, with the way they've been playing against the Denver offense, the way they've been playing. Time to move on to sits of the week.
Get on the bench.
All right, at sits of the week, to kind of go along with the start defense of the week, Drew Lock is my sit of the week for quarterback. He has less than 20 points in every single week except for 1. And again, he's only played about 5 or 6 of the games. And in the last 5 weeks, he has thrown 10 interceptions in 5 weeks. That's an average of 2 interceptions a week, in less than 300 yards in every game he's played except for 1. And sometimes it just seems like he's trying to throw the ball to the defense. A lot of passes off target by a lot, and some of them just float into the defense's hands. So just a very bad matchup for a quarterback who is not playing well. So Drew Lock would be that sit of the week at quarterback. Duke Johnson versus New England this week. Yeah, if you're going to sit any running back, sit a backup who did not have any volume last week. I mean, he is playing New England. They're middle of the pack against running backs. But the volume for PPR leagues is just not there. He didn't have any catches last week and only had 15 carries in each of the last 2 games. New England gives up 18.1 fantasy points to running backs, and there's not really another running back for Johnson to split anything with. But he's just not going to get the production because last week I think he had like 5 points. He's not a guy that I think you could plug in. He's a sit this week, and, hopefully he proves me wrong. That'd be cool. But I just don't see it happening for Duke Johnson this week. At wide receiver, I'm going to say Mike Evans versus the Los Angeles Rams. The Rams are first to fantasy wide receivers this year. They only give up about 14.67 fantasy points to wide receivers. And with Antonio Brown becoming a bigger role, the way that Tom Brady will spread the ball around, and Jalen Ramsey probably will shadow Mike Evans, I just don't think it's a good matchup for Evans. And if any receiver for Tampa Bay is going to have a decent game, it's not going to be Mike Evans. His only chance, I think, of having a decent game is if they get down in the red zone and they throw Mike Evans 2 passes for 2 touchdowns on short yardage. I don't think Mike Evans, though, is going to have that kind of week, and I think it's going to be tough for him to score fantasy points this week. At tight end, this one's probably just because he burned me last week. But Jared Cook against Atlanta, even though Atlanta's 32nd to tight ends, Jared Cook just hasn't been producing. He has less than 5 points in the last 2 weeks, only 2 targets and 0 receptions last week. And Jameis Winston, again, is starting this week. So I don't know if I can trust Jared Cook at all, even though Atlanta is the worst team against fantasy tight ends. Maybe these receivers and tight ends for New Orleans are more valuable with a guy like Jameis Winston, but I just don't see it happening. And then the defense sit this week is the Bengals against Washington. I think this is a trap game. It looks like everything good on paper for the Bengals, because they're playing Washington. Washington is the 27th ranked offense, and they have Alex Smith starting, who's only played decent, is still trying to get back into the hang of things. But the Bengals defense isn't good. I mean, they have scored less than 5 points in every week except for one where they scored 6. It just looks like a good matchup, but I still don't think the Bengals defense is good enough to actually be start worthy this week. I think there's a lot of better options. You got Miami, the Chargers, teams like that have better matchups and better defenses. So the Bengals, I just think you sit them out this week. They're probably on your waivers, so don't pick them up. It's time to move on to buy or sell from last week in this week. All right, so the buy or sell results from last week. Tough week for me, that's for sure. We started off with Deshaun Watson will have 300 passing yards against Cleveland. I bought it and Brock sold it, or 300 total yards, sorry. And Deshaun Watson only had 199 total yards. It was a very weathery game. It was tough for either team to really move the ball. But Deshaun Watson just absolutely did not do anything. So I lost out on that one. Then you had DK Metcalf will have 87 receiving yards against the Rams. Again, Jalen Ramsey is a stud. Brock and I both bought it. Jalen Ramsey was shadowing DK Metcalf the entire game, shut him down. He only had 28 receiving yards last week. which makes me 0 for 2. And then we had Alvin Kamara will have 21.5 fantasy points against San Francisco. I sold it for the sheer fact of I hoped it would just jinx him and he wouldn't have a big game. And Brock bought it, and he ended up being the number 1 running back on the week with 34.8 fantasy points. So Brock went 2-1. I went 0 for 3. Hopefully can turn it around this week. So this week we have Matt Ryan will have 300 passing yards against New Orleans. It's a favorable matchup, I believe. If I can take a look real quick, Ryan had a good game the first time they played the Saints. Oh, so they haven't even played the Saints yet this year. I swore they did, but they haven't. I think if Calvin Ridley's back, it makes it an easy buy, but there's still not any official word on whether Ridley will be in this week. I'm going to go ahead and buy it anyway. It's Matt Ryan, and that offense is a passing offense, so I think he does it this week. Then we have Lamar Jackson will have 21.5 fantasy points against Tennessee. That's just tough. I mean, you have Lamar Jackson who should be able to score 21.5 fantasy points because he's Lamar Jackson. He can throw the ball, run the ball. He just hasn't thrown it very effectively this year. And against Tennessee, I mean, they let a guy like Kirk Cousins have a 40-point fantasy week, so I'm going to go ahead and buy that one as well. That one will probably come back to bite me for sure, but I'm just going to have to trust that Lamar Jackson, with his running ability and passing, that he's got a chance of that 21.5 fantasy points. Then you have Derrick Henry will have 85 rushing yards versus Baltimore. And that's another tough one because Baltimore is a great defense. And Derrick Henry did not have a great game last time out. So I'm going to go ahead and buy it. I'm going to buy the farm, I guess, this week. It's Derrick Henry. It's hard to go against Derrick Henry in any week. All right, so that was buy or sell for this week. Let's move on to the matchups.
Prime time football.
All right, so a reminder that the Buffalo Bills, Chicago Bears, New York Giants, and San Francisco 49ers are on bye this week. We'll start off with the Thursday night matchup. You have Arizona versus Seattle. The community poll on this, 69% Seattle. If I'm not mistaken, it was Arizona that came out on top the last time they played. It's got a huge over-under at 57.5 points. I mean, it's a tough game because both defenses aren't great. But you have Arizona, who's the number 1 offense this season, Seattle, who's the number 3 offense this season, and then Seattle, who's the worst defense, and Arizona, who's middle of the pack. We highlighted Kyler Murray. He had a real nice game against Seattle the last time they played. Chase Edmonds has been decent. DeAndre Hopkins. I think offensively for both teams, you can start absolutely everybody. But, I think maybe a little redemption, especially from how last week went with Seattle and the last time these two teams played. I think Seattle is going to go ahead and take it, and it's going to be a big game offensively for both teams. Plug everyone in. Moving on to the Sunday morning matchups that I kind of want to highlight a little bit. You have Tennessee and Baltimore. Should be a very fun game to watch. Baltimore's got a great defense. Their offense is mediocre, middle of the pack, not great, not bad. And then Tennessee, who's been kind of on a backslide for the past few weeks, but they're still a good team. They have a lot of weapons. It's kind of hard. Tennessee, I think, has a good chance of winning this game just because they have a better offense and their defense isn't terrible. I think they'll be able to move the ball better than Baltimore. You have Ryan Tannehill. I don't think I would start Ryan Tannehill this week. If there's a better pivot option that you have on your team, you could turn that way. But I, contrary to that, think you could start Derrick Henry. I'm sure he'll have, that over 85 yards or whatever it was. A.J. Brown will be a main target. Corey Davis even could be a flex option for you this week. Baltimore, it's kind of tough. Their offense just hasn't been a fantasy start everybody offense. Running back situation, you just have all these different names jumbled together. There's not a lot of huge passing options. Mark Andrews, I would definitely start. He's just a top end tight end now, so I think he's a guy that you could plug in. And Lamar Jackson, I mean, you almost have to every week, and that's the terrible thing about his draft position, because he was probably the second quarterback taken in every single draft. And you don't want to sit him because you invested such a high draft pick in him. Winning the game wise, I think Tennessee gets back on track and wins this game, but you just never know. Baltimore's got a great defense, so we'll just have to see. But I think Tennessee in that game. Then we have Detroit versus Carolina. This just seems like a game that's going to be fun to watch. Neither team's fantastic, but neither team is terrible. Which is also funny. So both teams, both their quarterbacks are still questionable as of this point. But either way, neither defense is fantastic. I mean, they're both all right, pretty much middle of the pack teams when it comes to everything. You could look out for DeAndre Swift because Carolina's rushing defense isn't all that great, and DeAndre Swift has really been picking it up and playing well. And on the other side, Mike Davis, he seems like he's running out of steam, but Detroit is a plus matchup, a good opportunity for him to, have another one of those big games like he's had in the past this season. But that's going to be a very fun game to watch. I think Detroit actually will be able to take this game. They played pretty well last week, and if it comes down to it, they have Matt Prater. The final Sunday morning game that is worth noting is New England and Houston. New England they looked pretty good last week. Cam Newton actually was a decent quarterback. I mean, he's playing decent, not as bad as he was when he was getting benched in the third, fourth quarter. In Houston, there's always a chance that Houston is just going to have a huge offensive week. New England does have a good defense, but I think, Deshaun Watson, Will Fuller, Brandon Cooks, they're going to be the main focal points of that offense, especially with Duke Johnson as the running back. Maybe if they get him involved, this game becomes even more interesting, because then New England has to start covering more and doing more. But I honestly think New England's going to win this game. Then we move on to Sunday afternoon, a very, very interesting matchup with the Packers and the Colts. You have Aaron Rodgers and Davante Adams, who both have been lighting up fantasy football. Just everything goes to Davante Adams. Indy's defense is pretty good, but I do note that they haven't played any great offenses this season, and they've had a few games where they've played good wide receivers, good quarterbacks, and not played exactly all that well. And now they're going against Green Bay, where they have Aaron Rodgers, who's a top 10 quarterback, Davante Adams, who just sheer volume-wise is one of the top receivers. And then you always have that Marquez Valdez-Scantling 70-yard touchdown possibility. But Green Bay has also played really close and lost to some teams they probably shouldn't have. But I still think I just believe in Green Bay's offense more than I believe in anything else for Indy. But it's going to be a fun game to watch. And then you have Dallas and Minnesota. I believe Dallas is getting Andy Dalton back. But honestly, I think if they want their best chance to win, it would be keeping whoever it was last week. Oh, forgive me. His name is slipping my mind. But he played really well. Gilbert, right? Oh, lordy. Yeah, Garrett Gilbert. I think he honestly gave them a really good chance to win in his game against Pittsburgh, who Pittsburgh's the only undefeated team left. So, we'll have to see how that goes with Dallas. But Minnesota is a team that's, on fire. They've been playing really well, been winning games, starting to kind of figure out the flow of everything that they need to. I think Minnesota continues their winning streak, you could say. I think they're going to play really well. You obviously can start literally everybody on the Minnesota offense. Kirk Cousins, I think, will have a great game. Adam Thielen, Dalvin Cook will probably eat Dallas alive. And Justin Jefferson. The only problem with starting those receivers and that quarterback is if they just feed Dalvin Cook the whole time, because Dallas isn't going to be able to stop him. That could impact their fantasy value. But I think you start everybody against Dallas, and Minnesota wins pretty handedly, but you never know. Dallas has made some games close that maybe shouldn't have been close. Moving on to Sunday night, you have the Kansas City Chiefs versus the Las Vegas Raiders. Big time divisional matchup. The Raiders played the Chiefs very well the last time they played, and honestly, I think it's going to be another good game. Patrick Mahomes had a huge game against them. And on the flip side, Derek Carr had a really good game against the Chiefs. And yeah, I mean, Travis Kelce, an obvious start. You've got Tyreek Hill, who, again, is an obvious start. The running back position for the Chiefs anymore is just too murky. I think they're trying to do too much back there. But I guess if you're going to start one, it would be Clyde Edwards-Helaire. And then Josh Jacobs on the other side, a definite start. Darren Waller. But when it comes to the Raiders receiving core beyond Waller, I honestly don't know. It's kind of a catch one out of the air and throw him in there. You have Hunter Renfrow, who gets involved, Henry Ruggs, Nelson Aguilar. I think if the Raiders get down early, could be a big time, have to get them the ball, throw the ball more, get them more involved. But I think the Chiefs have a better chance of winning this game just because they're the Chiefs and they are a more complete team. But the Raiders played them really tough last time. Hopefully they play them tough again to make another interesting matchup. But I think the Chiefs have that game pretty well in hand. And then moving on to Monday night, you have the Rams and the Buccaneers. This is a game that, honestly, the Bucs are 7-3, the Rams are 6-3. And it's kind of tough because in my eyes, both teams are pretty inconsistent with how they play. You have the Buccaneers, who play really terrible, come back the next week, play really well, play really terrible, come back the next week, play really well. And they're coming off of one of those played really well weeks. And then the Rams, their defense keeps them in it most of the time because they don't have a super potent offense. And they're going against Tampa Bay, who also has a good defense. So I think it's going to be tough for the Rams to move the football, and Tampa Bay has just a better chance at throwing or moving the football because their offense is better. But I think this is going to be a very defensive game, and both teams are going to have to fight very hard offensively to win this game. I wouldn't be surprised if the first touchdown scored in this game was a defensive touchdown. But, you can start Brady. Maybe. Yeah, you could start Brady. Jared Goff, I don't know if I would start him this week against Tampa Bay. With that defense, it's just hard to do that. Receiver-wise, it's very hard to start any receivers either. So I don't know if you view this game as a huge fantasy impact game, just because I don't know if you necessarily want to play all of the players that will be in it. But it's almost like you have to, because they're all just great players and have that chance to play well. But I think Tampa Bay has a better chance of winning this game than the Rams, just because they have a better offense, and both defenses are pretty evenly matched. All right, folks, that's it this week for the Lucky Shots podcast. Thanks for tuning in, and don't forget to give us a like, subscribe, all that kind of stuff, and leave some comments, give us some feedback, and let us know what you think is going to happen in some of these games, and who are some people you may have questions about. Thanks for listening. Have a good day.